If you can come on in and take your seats. We said we'd start promptly at 10:45, and we definitely want to keep on schedule. I'm going to start naming names. I see my Lumina colleagues are not paying attention to me, which is typical around the office, but not acceptable here. So, all right. There you go. I see. That's good. Jamie and Holly are ignoring me, but everybody else is paying attention now, so that's good. All right. Thanks very much. I don't know about you, but in looking at the agenda for today's event, the program, I have to say quite sincerely that this was the panel I was most looking forward to. This is the one where we actually hear from colleges and universities around the United States that have actually used the DQP in tuning and will report on their experiences. And I think we will perhaps hear, I actually hope we will hear the good, the bad, and the ugly about all of those activities. To help us, lead us through this conversation is Jillian Kinsey, who's the Associate Director of NALOA, the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, who will moderate this session.
Thank you, Dwayne. Good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. I am the senior scholar with the National Institute for Learning Outcome Assessment, just to clarify. And I am the associate director of the Indiana University Center for Post-Secondary Research. And I'm happy to be up here today kind of grounding the work that we've been doing in trying to understand how the DQP and tuning functions out in the field. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and a couple of objectives just to make sure we're all on the same page here. We do hope to summarize, or at least invite the panel to summarize some of the key outcomes from the DQP and tuning work that they've been engaged in, and then to describe and talk about, as Dwayne suggested, perhaps the good, bad, and the ugly, but focusing on really what facilitated effective use and what facilitated the good work that went on campuses over the last really couple years now that the DQP and tuning have been in the field, tuning for a little bit longer in the field. And I'll serve as moderator, try to keep this panel at least reined in a bit, and then invite your questions closer to the end. I'll introduce the panelists briefly, although their bios are included in your packet. And I hope you reference them. To my right, or at least I'll start from my right, I have Maggie Bailey, who's from Point Loma Nazarene University in California. She's the Vice Provost for Program Development and Accreditation. And to her right is Norm Jones, who is a Professor of History and Chair of General Education at Utah State University. And then to his right is Elise Martin, who is the Dean of Assessment at Middlesex Community College in Massachusetts. And then to her right is John Young, who's the Provost at Fayetteville State University in North Carolina. So I'm happy that they have joined us for this panel. And trust me, these folks are in a good position to offer their point of view on the DQP and tuning use, both now and into the future, as this panel has been named. I have been able, through my work in NALOA, been able to see and witness and observe a lot of the good work going on at now hundreds of campuses that have taken up the challenge of applying and adopting and implementing and testing the DQP in particular. That has been our focus at NALOA. More recently. And in fact, our official role with this work was really harvesters, which I think is very appropriate for Indiana and Illinois, where our work is located. So we have been harvesting information from campuses to see what's worked, what hasn't worked, and to document and describe what's been going on campuses. So that's been really exciting. And Jamie mentioned his, perhaps I'll just describe it as delight, to find all the different ways that campuses have really thought about and used the DQP in particular, to further their focus on student learning. And a lot of that work is actually described. So one more plug for the new DQP that's now out, actually launched today. Appendix D actually includes about almost 20 examples of institutional use of the DQP. So I encourage you to refer to that for further information. So that's a good resource too. So I want to now begin by asking our panelists a little bit about what brought them into this work. How did you get involved in DQP and tuning? Did you come willingly, reluctantly, skeptically? How did you enter into this work, and what captured the interest of your campus or your system?
Well, thank you, Jillian, and I'll start off with that. We were really looking for a national framework. Our students had been taking a general knowledge assessment exam, both as freshmen and then again as seniors, and we had some scores, but they really didn't inform us about what students were learning. And they were not actionable. Faculty couldn't delve into what were the questions being asked and how can we then ensure that what we're teaching is teaching really true national standards. So I began looking, as well as others on campus, for a national framework. We had embraced the AAC and U-value rubrics as developmental rubrics, and we're using those both in general education as well as for capstone courses. So, and then both the CIC, the Council for Independent Colleges, as well as WASC, our accreditation agency, had brought it to our attention that there was this new framework, and immediately as we began to show it to faculty, then we saw that this really was an opportunity for us to really take what we were already doing both in general education and programs and put it into this organizing framework and look at these learning outcomes as new opportunities to eventually work towards national standards as well as possibly even benchmarking in the future.
At Fayetteville State University, we probably have not been involved in using the DQP as long as some of the other institutions represented here. Our actual significant engagement came as a result of our working with George Koo and his introducing it to our faculty at some workshops just a little over or nearly a year ago. And I think it's important for a campus to be at a certain level of development in its assessment of student learning for the DQP to begin to have significance on that. When having led this effort for a number of years, I mean, quite frankly, 6 or 7 years ago, our assessment of student learning was guided primarily by the fact that we were going to be undergoing an accreditation self-study in the next several years. And but the assessment at that level, at that point, was largely course-based, and faculty are really good at assessing learning outcomes at a course level. But then we moved our discussion of assessment to the program level, and now we're at a point where our faculty are doing a reasonably good job of assessing program learning outcomes, and now the DQP helps us to look at that in an even broader context. That is, not just program outcomes, but what does the degree mean? And I ask our faculty, you know, as the chief academic officer, I'm the one at commencement that always sort of verifies to the chancellor that these students have met all their requirements and are recommended for the degrees for which they've been applied. And so then the chancellor confers the degree. And I ask my colleagues, what does that really mean? I mean, when they walk across that stage, what is it they know and are able to do? And that has helped lead the discussion. But I think being at a certain point in our assessment, had we introduced something like the DQP 5 or 6 years ago, it probably would not have had as much impact. But we are very concerned with having now a national framework, and I think that's where the DQP has been very helpful to us, even though we're in a year into the discussion, but having a national framework to think in terms of how do our program learning outcomes associate with this, align with this broader framework. We do a lot of work. We have more new students who are transfer students from community colleges, that we have first-time students. And so it's very important to have some sort of framework where we can talk about not only our native students, but also transfer students in terms of what that progression from the associate to the bachelor's level means.
We came at it from a very different angle because of the faculty involvement in Utah. When Jillian asked, how did Utah get involved in this, I blame Cliff Ailman. Yeah. His gentle skills of persuasion. Because we started tuning first, and because Utah was involved in tuning, Utah State in particular was involved in tuning in history, physics, elementary education, and math. We found the DQP to be an absolutely logical next step. The process of tuning forces the majors to determine what their outcomes are, but of course, as soon as you ask what are your outcomes, you have to ask, and where did they come from? So we took the methodology of tuning and we took it to the faculty, and I do mean that in the most literal sense of taking it to the faculty. Our first conversations within the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, we arranged it so that untenured people were not in the room with members of their tenure committees. And we started asking the question, what do you want your students to know when they got in your class? What do you expect them to know, understand, be able to do when they arrive in your class? In the meantime, the majors were designing backwards as well, and they're asking questions of general education. But all of this means that the faculty were owning it because they could see the direct value of it. They could see, I'm teaching a course that you're using. You're teaching a course my students are taking. When it comes to assessment, we could see that what we were actually saying to the faculty is, you tell us how it is that you know that the student can do this. We took all that, we started redesigning Gen Ed. We've redesigned the first year program. So but this is all completely faculty driven. I've tried to count the number of heads in terms of faculty heads involved. I don't know, do we get to count administrators as faculty sometimes, Paul? This is one of the keys. Administrators are faculty. They still have their tenured appointments, so keep them in the conversation. But what we've done is we've had a conversation about where students really are, because it makes sense to the faculty to do it that way. And when we saw the DQP, of course, it was like, of course, this is the framework for this conversation. We were already asking the questions, but now we can see that how it all comes together. And Utah State had a degree profile. Since 1997, we've had one. Nobody knew what to do with it. And along came the DQP, and we said, oh, now we know what a profile is for. And the faculty could say, yeah, we do too. So it's been a very interesting faculty-driven discussion, and it's beginning to self-replicate. That's what I'm delighted to see, because once faculty start doing it, it starts becoming a natural conversation in departments.
Thanks. I see there are a lot of ways into this work, and timing sounds like it was really important. You were ready for this work. It came at the time we were looking for a framework, a qualifications framework. And I wonder, Norm, though, if you could talk a little bit more about the impact that this work now has had, given all the ways that you've layered on, starting with tuning and adding DQP. Can you talk a little bit about the impact?
Well, I think it's having an impact on students. We've been doing it long enough now that we're beginning to see the difference, and some of the evaluations we have done, focus groups. It's been fascinating because the students are giving us they are using the language, and so clearly we're having an impact on students. I can see it most clearly in the impact we're having on faculty. The faculty who teach in general education have got a whole new language, and it's a language that they are learning to speak because the university is asking them to justify their courses in those terms, but it's a natural language for them. So if the students are noticing, the faculty are noticing, student affairs now using the material. So I think in all those measurements, it's good. Where we have a problem is that the structures are not designed to celebrate or reward a lot of this kind of activity. And I'm talking about the T&P process. I'm also talking about the accreditation process, that we're doing things that don't seem to fit the playbook, and that really gets in the way sometimes.
Can
I jump in? Can I jump in on this, Jillian? There. Let me slide up so I can be heard. We came to this work thanks to AAC and Youth Quality Collaborative Project, and I know Carol's here in the audience, but okay, thank you. I'm from a community college in Massachusetts, and we, with our transfer university institution, came together as a dyad to participate in the application of the DQP to our work. And really what the DQP did for us there was to provide a sort of an organizing framework for prior assessment work for which we had been using value rubrics, assessing separate, discrete student development of skills and abilities. But now we had a way to pull them together in ways that made sense to faculty. And we also presented the DQP to faculty in these discipline groups across the two institutions as a tool to react to rather than a Bible for them to adhere to. And so with the sense that they were, in fact, able to offer recommendations for improvement, that certainly was a challenge and a creative opportunity for them to do so, and they did. It led us to the development of backwards design, scaffolded capstone projects or signature projects that would represent student achievement with these outcomes at different stages towards degree.
Any other impacts? What difference has this made?
Well, for us, there has been a very significant shift in higher education in the last couple of decades with regards to who owns the course and who owns the learning outcomes. It is, and I appreciate Carol bringing this up, that we're really talking at the program level. So when I started teaching a few years ago, I owned that course. I decided what textbook was going to be used. I wrote the syllabus. My department chair probably never saw it and didn't care about it, just assumed that because I had my doctorate that therefore I was doing an excellent job. But there was also no collaboration among all of us teaching in the program. And now those days are over with. And what is happening now throughout our campus, and I understand throughout campuses all over the country, is there's this sense of accountability and a sense of collaboration that is happening among program faculty. That is, we own this program and we are responsible and we have a higher level of accountability. And so one of the things that we embraced that was really a game changer for us was the NILOA transparency framework. And one of the things that happened was all of a sudden that became very, very public what our learning outcomes are and very public about what our assessment data. And so as we began to work towards degree qualification profile and began to use that, we said, many of the faculty were saying, these are really excellent outcomes. And now that everything is transparent, maybe we ought to consider moving to these national standards. So it's been a really important conversation. It's facilitated a lot of activity and collaboration on campus.
I would like to just pick up on both Norm and Maggie's comments for a second. Not to underestimate the value of having a language that helps faculty and administrators think in terms of learning outcomes. I think that the language of the DQP, the learning outcomes, is very rich language that lends itself to assessment. And I appreciate Maggie's comment about the notion of the faculty member and the individual course. I mean, the reality is, you're correct. I mean, the notion that we have a set of faculty, each of whom are responsible for individual courses in the curriculum, those days are really over. And yet, the truth of the matter is, many faculty colleagues still think in those terms. And I think having language of learning outcomes that speaks in a speaks of a broader set of learning outcomes, that you're not just teaching a course and students accumulate a number of courses, now they have a degree, but rather those courses contribute to some broader context, some broader framework of learning outcomes. I think that impact is very valuable. And so I know it would be good to speak of impact something more concrete than a rich language, but still that is I find very incredibly important. And I consider myself first and foremost a faculty member, and I teach and I struggle with clarifying my learning outcomes. And when you, as a faculty member, when I look at my colleagues' work, we speak of learning outcomes in terms of explain and appreciate and identify and understand. And the one I like best, I see this all the time, students will demonstrate an understanding of. And I say, what does that mean? But, I have to force myself as a teacher teaching a class to clarify my learning outcomes in such a way that, one, I can assess them meaningfully and that I can teach them significantly. So I would come back to saying the value of having that language to help us think of learning outcomes in a broader context.
I've seen this as liberating the faculty. I'll never forget one of the conversations we were having with the physicists, and somebody said, but the structure of the physics curriculum is a historical accident. Why do you think you have to teach it that way? Which is true. I mean, much of our curriculum is an artifact of maybe the early 20th century. Certainly as a historian, I'm looking way back into the 20s and 30s to the origins of the curriculum. And these conversations around the DQP have actually liberated the curriculum. And now, Carol, you'll be glad to know that I'm teaching a Western Civ course called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. It used to be Plato to Machiavelli or something like that. Because now you're saying, well, then it's not the content coverage, it's the proficiencies. And the content has to be in there, but there are many ways to get there. And I've seen this again and again, that as we've gone through the process, people are beginning to rethink how they deliver the curriculum, what's happening in their classrooms. And that's one of the reasons it's working. People are having a really good time.
Well, you've all mentioned different outcomes and the challenges that it takes to do this work. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what has made the work that you've been doing possible. What's helped it, and then I suppose we should cover the other side of that, what's hindered it. But let's start with some of the things that have been productive and generative in your work.
So I'm gonna pick up on the comment that people are having a really good time. I think that really fits nicely with our project. At our community college, we were given the opportunity again by AAC&U to work with our transfer university around some aspect of the DQP. And what my colleagues at the university and I decided was that we did not want to create an assessment project. We wanted to create a project or facilitate a project that would engage faculty at a very intellectually challenging level. Scholarship of teaching and learning work, and that's the background that I come from. And so we decided that we would bring together 4 of our high transfer programs and provide them with the framework for the DQP and ask them to think about the relationship within their program to some of the outcomes, and we focused on the intellectual skills of the DQP. We ensured that the faculty makeup of these discipline-based teams was representative of both institutions with an overlap at the freshman-sophomore level. So we had faculty teaching freshman-sophomore courses from the community college. We had faculty teaching those same courses as well as upper-level courses from the university participating in this. And we kind of gave them open rein as to what does this mean and how would you implement this? How can you help us to understand this and contextualize it within your disciplines? And in 2 of the 4 discipline cases, what ended up happening was that to use a catchphrase, many of the faculty in those discipline groups found that they were perhaps throwing the same mud against the wall over and over again in their courses within the same institution, because we don't facilitate much opportunity for faculty to talk about pedagogy and curriculum in meeting spaces. And then suddenly students got to the capstone level course experience at the university, where certainly complex problem-solving skills were required of them. And quite often, the faculty teaching those courses and the students themselves were disappointed in the results, in their ability to do this work, this complex work. And so what these two discipline groups in particular who really clicked decided was that they needed to look backwards at how these skills, these intellectual skills, were being developed in a contextual way throughout the program. The beauty of having faculty from both the community college and the university teaching at those lower level courses is that the associate degree framework from the DQP became not something that was ours, off which they built, but rather shared ours, because that sophomore level is the equivalent of the associate degree. And so there was a lot of very deep conversation about how we could use backwards design to scaffold student development of these skills and abilities in increasingly more complex ways. After the development of these capstone or signature assignments that were vetted by each other with a lot of peer feedback to see if the peers thought, that the other faculty in the group thought that those assignments were likely to elicit the outcomes at the intended level, the faculty implemented those assignments. And never in my role as Dean of Assessment at my college have I seen such eager faculty coming to an assessment day to look at products of student work. These were products of assignments that these folks had really put a lot of time and interest into. They crafted assignments. These are the artists coming back to look at the products. And so the loop was very easy to close at that point.
That sounds very picturesque and grand. I love that. I love the notion. I almost want to just stop there and think about, wow, how did you do that? That's wonderful. I imagine it wasn't quite as grand and picturesque for everyone, was it? Anybody ever?
I think that we, I hesitate to use the term culture of assessment. We overuse that term, but I do think that if I think what made this work possible and what were some of the challenges, first of all, it is that long-term effort of building a campus culture of assessment. Now, and I look around the room, and we've benefited from the work of many people around this room to help engage faculty in the kind of research and efforts you've been making to help us build that culture of assessment. Now, I'm blessed, first of all, because I have a boss. My chancellor, James A. Anderson, is a national assessment leader. He probably knows more about student learning and teaching and learning than many people in the country, so I'm blessed there. But for example, we engaged faculty, the AAC&U, the Greater Expectations, when we were revising our general education. We've continued to use those rubrics, the value rubrics, as we've assessed our general education. We participated in Foundations of Excellence, and so we rebuilt our freshman year. We've relied on George and Jillian's research using NESE, and we've been, I think the key thing is engaging faculty, because faculty like research and faculty like data evidence-based practices. And so when you can show faculty that there's evidence to support certain things certain efforts that you're undertaking, that makes a difference. So I think building that culture of assessment is really important. And I think out of that, someone said earlier this morning, faculty champions. I think out of those discussions, faculty champions begin to emerge, so that it's not something that's coming from them, the administrators, but something that is coming from the faculty. I don't want to, as we think about some of the challenges, I really don't want to underestimate the value of Brobbery here, because from a chief academic officer's perspective, if you want faculty to spend their time, and faculty have so many demands on their time, and the first thing we want them to do is work with their students. So if you're going to use their time, you're going to have to give them some sort of incentives and compensation. We use either pay over the summer or course reassignments or stipends. And what happens with those efforts, of course, sometimes you have some individuals who just do what they need to do to get the money or to take the time. But if as you bribe them, you show them how to do it well, and you have effective faculty development efforts, then I think you can see the benefit. And that's really made a difference for us. I mean, we serve 65% of our students are African American, 6% are Latino, 48% adult learners, 21% military affiliates, they're soldiers or veterans. I mean, we're not one of the 95, we're not one of the 5%, we're one of the 95% who admit more than 50% of the students who apply. But you know, I think our faculty members are well aware of the fact that it's, you know, we can make a profound difference in the lives of our students and in the lives of our state and nation by enabling our students to develop the kind of skills, the knowledge, dispositions that will enable them not only to lead a meaningful life, but also to give something back. And I think many of our faculty, we're very fortunate. We've got a very good faculty who sees this work in that context of making a difference in the lives of our students and in our state.
There was also the issue for us of we're very small, 3,600 students, located in San Diego, a very small liberal arts school, and our faculty saw right away that it was an opportunity to participate in a national conversation. And so often the liberal arts schools, we feel like the changes in higher education are happening around us, and yet we are not invited to the table or feel like we have a voice to speak into it. And so this they saw right away as that Lumina was really providing us an opportunity to speak into this national conversation, and that was a huge motivation on our campus.
You know, I know this work is challenging too, and I wonder, Norm has already introduced the idea of the challenges of promotion and tenure processes that don't necessarily reward this kind of work. You hinted that perhaps accreditation is not designed to reward this kind of work. Are there ways to get around that and work through those processes, or have you found anything that's helped?
Well, sometimes I feel like that when the revolution comes, all will be well. Because one of the issues structurally, and I can only speak for the world that I know, so I know every institution is slightly different. But we schedule courses by departments, not by thinking about student outcomes. We build curriculum without thinking about student outcomes. I mean, I'm Director of General Education. You'd think that something that I tried to calculate it. I think my department of general education has 25,000 students a semester in it. But it's not a department. It's totally dependent upon the goodwill of others to schedule some courses whenever they think that they'd like to schedule some courses. You know, when you're thinking about a student-centered curriculum, that's a big issue. The assessment tools that we have are very poorly designed for this. I was kind of smiling at the culture of assessment because every faculty member lives in a culture of assessment. They will instantly tell you, yes, they grade their papers. But so often our culture of assessment has nothing to do with what the assessment is that they do. Right. And that's another one of these places where we have issues. I raise the accreditors simply because accreditors quite often ask you to assess your general education program as if it was freestanding. Students are not freestanding. There's no way to know for sure how a student acquired a certain proficiency at a certain point in the curriculum. You can't just say, well, they took that class there. We're going to ignore the fact that they got married and they had 2 children and they worked 3 jobs. No, it's just that class. So, and then there's the overlap between the major and the way the student uses the major versus the other experiences in the institution. I could go on and on, but we have not started to picture the institutions holistically with the student in the center of the picture to watch how that student actually behaves within it.
Other comments? Yeah.
Well, I think it is unrealistic to think that we can make a real difference in student learning and having a learning-centered, student-centered campus without looking at the tenure, promotion, reappointment, reward system. And so, again, I think that has to happen. If we think we can leave that in place, none of this will happen because, again, faculty are very, very reasonable and they will do the things for which they're rewarded. And so it's really imperative to build that reward system around those values. I mean, again, our faculty spend most of their time teaching. They certainly do some research and they're expected to do some research, but fortunately, again, we've had a faculty committee that's redesigned our evaluation, our annual evaluation process, and so that teaching and learning, but more significantly, the use of assessment to guide improvements, that is part of the evaluation system on an annual basis. And so those cumulative results are certainly considered at the point at which a person comes up for tenure and promotion. We've taken that model, we had to redesign. This UNC system has a real emphasis on post-tenure review, so we've placed that in our post-tenure review, and faculty have to include that as part of their portfolio. So again, we've tried to face that challenge by incorporating those values into the system so that it counts. Those things count. Those things matter when those important personnel decisions are made. And if we don't do that, a lot of these other things will just fall by the wayside.
I'm just going to add a little bit, again, from the community college perspective. Community colleges come to the table with a teaching and learning mission, and so they are quite often your most willing participants in work that is focused in the improvement of student learning. But that work doesn't go far without the collaboration of their four-year colleagues. So community college faculty inherently want to know that they have prepared their students well for transfer and or career placement. What was the enticement in our project to bring the four-year, or once the four-year institution faculty had been recruited for the project, what the enticement was to keep them there engaged in the work was the idea that, in fact, if we are going to use some kind of a backwards design model to identify how students develop increasingly complex abilities with these skills and abilities and habits of mind, then we know that we would be best off starting at the end and working backwards. So it put the faculty from the university, from the four-year institution, teaching those upper-level courses in a position to look at their capstone assignment requirements, capstone project requirements, and map them to themselves within a group to the expectations outlined by the framework of the DQP. And then we could work backwards from there. So without those folks saying, here's where you folks teaching at the lower levels need to bring your students to, we developed a system of collaboration, recognizing that every point, each rung of the ladder was an important rung. Students weren't going to do well if they skipped a rung. So there was incentive at both ends there for faculty to come together around this work.
There was one hindrance that I think we occasionally meet, and that is it's a cultural issue, and that when accreditation is brought up, and that is the days of compliance are really over with. This issue is continuous improvement. So a compliance mentality is that we are going to do this, it's due on the 30th of September, and we're done. And so that is, when I talk to the faculty, we are we understand now, and this has been a little bit slower for some of us to begin to capture, that this isn't going away. We really do care about what the students are learning, and this is a continual conversation. So early on, I think there are still some that want to hold out and still have that, well, accreditation is making us do this. And no, accreditation is not making us do this. This is really that we care deeply and passionately about what our students are learning and benchmarking those against national standards. And this is a conversation that we should engage in every single day. And the compliance issues, and we all know that they are out there, but again, I feel that that's my responsibility. They do the work of assessing student learning, and they tell that important story, and then all the other will be taken care of. If they can tell that and do it in a meaningful and powerful way, and they can show how that has led to curricular improvements as well as program improvements, then their job is done. And that conversation goes on every single day on campus.
I want to offer the panelists another moment to respond to some of these questions, but I also want to alert you that we would like to take some questions from the floor. So if there are some questions that you're thinking about, and I see, okay, good, I see this needed no prompting. Good, okay, well let me turn to the panelists for one last comment. Norm, I think you may have wanted to say something. I don't know.
Well, I wanted to back up what Elise is saying. And one of the things that, of course, the tuning process taught us is that you cannot reform your curriculum or have a DQP or anything else in a vacuum, because you've got to be talking to your transfer institutions. And in a sense, you only have one faculty. Those are all the people that have taught those students. And if the disciplines aren't talking to their colleagues in other institutions and understanding how the degree is being built, you're never going to get where we want to get. So you're absolutely right. We have to keep that conversation going.
Thanks. All right. Well, why don't we turn to the floor here for some
Okay, Robert Stein again. I want to focus on the few terms: assessment, student-focused. And I want to pick on transfer for a second. I want to throw another A word in: aspiration. I've worked in transfer for decades, and I've watched states pat themselves on the back because we've moved from seat time, credit hour, course title, and we have much more supposedly positive policy that's focused on syllabi analysis, equivalency. But when it comes right down to it, transfer isn't driven by student mastery and evidence of student work. It's driven by ideals of what we in the academy want our students to learn, and we tell our transfer institutions, here's my syllabus, here's yours, and at least that's the typical model. Okay, so what I want to focus on is the transparency, and I'm really impressed with the sharing of artifacts and student work. And I find myself, as I talk to faculty who do tuning and DQP, are you talking about wanting to make my evaluation of my students transparent? Well, that's a little discomforting. I've gone to campuses which say, yes, we've moved to collective ownership. I put all those things on my syllabus because my department chair expects it of me. And I've checked it off, but then on one-on-one, no, I don't talk about it with my students. So there's a lot of variation here. And what I'm really wanting to focus on is something that DQP says that is different from where we've been for years on assessment. It says mastery of every student. Mm-hmm. That isn't program evaluation. Student mastery makes student the unit of analysis. It says, part of the hindrance and challenge, what are we doing in those large-scale institutions? We're not picking a quick test. There'll be time this afternoon about building assignment libraries. how much are faculty really engaging in sharing their assignments and asking for peer validation. I'm a good evaluator of my students because I've been grading them for decades, but now I know I'm doing it well.
Anyone want to take this one? I think it's a good comment.
The question is, how much are we focused on measuring every student if we're student focused, using assignments as opposed to a test off the shelf, driven by the good work of DQP and tuning, and how much are faculty on your campuses and nationwide really willing to make their grading public, moving from a private enterprise to a public enterprise.
I'll tell you what, we're going to put two questions in one, because that raises, and Elise has heard this before, record keeping. When you get through with all of this, how are you keeping records in an age of proficiency? What does a degree audit look like for Tony, for example, in an age of proficiency? So do we give him a diploma supplement at the end? What do we say, et cetera, et cetera? And that relates to the question Bob raised. And I'd like to know whether any of you have even thought about it, and if so, what you're going to do about it. Bye.
All right, they're ready.
Cliff, that was very concise for you.
Full credit.
Well, we have thought about it, and frankly, this is another one of those structural issues, because we usually put it in terms of what if you get a student who, at the end, has 120 hours, or more likely 140 hours, and does not demonstrate competence in the capstone. There is no place to indicate that this student received the degree which the state said that the student had the right to, but this student is incompetent. I have a colleague who's been using the DQP2 with the the competency languages. He actually tells his students when they're incompetent. It does not go down well. But that's on his grading rubric. So it's a conversation that you get into as soon as you start looking at the world through this lens. But it's a conversation that is very difficult to solve at any level lower than at least as maybe a state system, because the registrars and everybody are completely programmed to do it the way they do it. So we can show you we've got iterator reliability on capstones, we've got all that kind of thing, but there's no place to put it in the record for across the board.
I'll speak about how far away we are from those places as you raise those questions. What I would say is 2 points I'd like to make is that using the DQP framework ended up causing faculty teaching at the capstone level in many cases and levels below to change their capstone assignments to elicit higher, more complex levels of learning on the part of students. So to the degree that the framework can be used to improve the complexity, the increasing complexity of curriculum and student expectations around that curriculum, and then the grading system is based on that, we are bringing closer together the learning outcomes and our current system of grading. Second of all, I'd like to give a little shout out for the state of Massachusetts right now, because the Commissioner of Higher Education, Commissioner Friedman, and the Deputy Commissioner are organizing a group of faculty from 6 disciplines, I believe. They're beginning with 6 programs that are transfer programs, bringing people in to talk about transfer and articulation agreements across the state, and asked for representatives from each institution to participate in these conversations, each of our publicly funded institutions. And it was my provost, among others, I believe, as a result of our Quality Collaboratives project and work that's been extended beyond that, that encouraged the commissioner to include in these conversations not just discussion of common course numbering and course content, but course outcomes as based on the work that these faculty were doing. So only the beginning, but at least that's happening this year.
Thanks. Go ahead.
For higher education. Mildred Garcia in the previous panel stressed the importance of bringing students and especially alumni into the whole DQP process. And in the spirit of tuning, I might also add employers into that list as well. My question is, to what extent have you been able to do that? And if you have done this successfully, could you share a best practice with us so that the rest of us would identify some good ways of accomplishing that objective?
Who's got a good example? Go ahead.
I have many examples of things we've tried. The parents is a slightly easier one. We've done on YouTube. There are videos, including one of a Prezi that I made that my colleagues tell me is nauseating.
Literally,
but
it makes them sing only because of the demand.
But this nauseating Prezi, we show it to both. It's available for students and their parents, and then when they come on campus to register, we take the parents and put them in another room and show them this. And the students I very seldom hear back from. I've heard a lot from parents because they understand it. I mean, they inherently understand what the Prezi does is it takes the student and shows. He's called Cuddly D Student. He's the avatar of my colleague Dan here, and walks the student through from the time, what do they bring with them to college? How do you know that they've got it? What choices they're making? How does gen ed work? How does the major work? What is the degree? So that you end up with the whole degree profile displayed. So that works well with the parents. We haven't tried it on any employers yet, but since employers often are employers, or parents often are employers, I don't see why it doesn't work, because the thoughtful, mature people do understand this, because if they've been through college, they understand it easily. I think we need to display it to everybody, but life teaches you these lessons, and you understand that the degree profile is also about the same lessons.
I wish that I could speak of a best practice, especially in terms of engaging employers, but increasingly our program faculty, our School of Business, our School of Education, have developed advisory committees comprised of members of the community, members of the business community, with the explicit focus on looking at the kinds of work our students are producing, the kind of learning outcomes we're helping them achieve, and how valuable are those to those employers. I mean, our interaction with employers, organizations. Typically, however, they focus more on those broader communication skills, thinking skills, quantitative reasoning, ethical. It's difficult sometimes to get them to get into the details of the profession as much as getting at those more general skill sets that they're looking for in graduates.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead, Teddy.
Teddy Safman with the Utah System of Higher Education and also adjunct faculty, meaning I'm a bureaucrat and adjunct faculty. I think language is extremely important, and yet I heard two of you refer to a national framework which speaks of a ministry. I think if our faculty who grew into the DQP through tuning, and this was over a 5-year period because Lumina trusted us and funded us, I think if our faculty thought that the national framework came from the Congress to the Department of Education, it would be a non-starter. And so I think that the language we use is extremely important. It is a national dialogue now. By faculty, we've seen many, many changes also through Lumina's work, and I think we need to be careful how we talk about it.
Good point, yeah. Maybe we're using little n as national, if that's possible to use it. Yeah, Erica.
Hey, good morning. Erica Williams from North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro, North Carolina. I've appreciated the conversation this morning centered around faculty ownership, faculty embracing. I am a tenured faculty member back in A&T. I am concerned, however, about how we fold the student affairs, student life, those other aspects of our candidates' experiences on campuses into this and what your experiences have been. And I'm also interested and knowing how or if any of you have had experiences on your campus with this, the rollout of the DQP and an online shift. Our university, like many universities, have moved quite speedily towards online education, and I wonder if there are nuances or stories from the field that we could walk away with to use from where you all have been.
If I could just address a co-curricular issue, I think the area of civic and global engagement is a natural place to begin that conversation. On our campus, we have students going out all over the world serving in marginalized economies and economies that are underdeveloped, both domestic and international. And that is often where our curricular and co-curricular programs come together. And we have some pilot programs, community-based learning, which is an inner-city program that our students participate in. I think that one of the delightful things that has come out is the fact that this really engages the co-curricular in the conversation of them being part of this, of the student experience. And this provides a space where they certainly are not only at the table, but they're critical to that conversation. So for us, I think more than some of the other areas of the DQP, I think that's an area where we've engaged them and continue to work in this area.
Elise or Bob? Elise?
Go ahead.
I think I'll probably just be echoing a bit of what Maggie just said, but we also within the area of social responsibility or civic learning and global learning, we have brought into our design projects professional staff who are from student affairs who are involved in this work. Unfortunately, we aren't able to compensate them, but so they come to the work willingly, which is even nicer. But they serve in two capacities within these projects: A, as a resource for faculty who are looking for ideas to build learning experiences within the semester that would enable greater success with the capstone level representation of learning and growth, and also to develop ideas for programming learning activities within their own programs that would elicit levels of student learning appropriate.
I wonder if we can take
let me
Ralph. Oh, John, you have a
just
comment?
I promise one sentence besides that one, that I really believe that online education has enriched our discussion of assessment of student learning.
All right, very concise. All right, Ralph. Yeah.
Ralph Wolf, former president of the WASC Senior College Commission, currently a consultant. We use the DQP, and in our handbook and our standards at 28 pilot institutions. So what I'm curious about is, and it may be too early to answer definitively, the sustainability of the use of the document. A lot of the literature talks about it's a great conversation starter. I have seen institutions use it to revise curriculum, GE, the combination integration. But is it a booster rocket that falls away, or how have you found to keep drawing the document, the DQP, in to keep enlivening the conversation about the many dimensions of the DQP that are often overlooked in the first initial conversations? Because I have found it to be very rich. Each time I read it, I see something new, but my experience are some institutions set it aside as they move into curricular reform, and I'm just wondering, have you had any experience, or what are you doing to sustain the use of the depth and the richness of the document?
So,
quick answer?
Meaning, quality, and integrity of the degree. WASC has a new narrative that we write to meaning, quality, and integrity of the degree, and that is essentially what is bringing together that conversation. And what we have done is we have mapped the different aspects of the degree qualification. So, for example, intellectual skills aligns very well with core competencies. And the 5 core competencies that we assess in WASC, and that includes writing, oral information literacy, critical thinking, quantitative reasoning. And what we do is we align those. So one of the things that when we began this conversation is we aren't necessarily asking faculty to do anything more in addition to, but to take a look at the work that they're already doing and use this as an organizing framework for that work. So when we look at specialized knowledge, that really is the program learning outcomes. Many of the program learning outcomes. So what we did was to take that and then reverse engineer to lay on what faculty were already doing. So that really addresses the sustainability issues. If we were to ask them, you know, here is your body of evidence, your body of work, your body of assessment data, and oh, by the way, we want you to do something different in addition, then that would not have been a very fruitful conversation. But this approach, I think, has been very, very helpful. So what faculty are doing is they're saying, oh, well, we're looking at this organizing framework and these proficiencies and outcomes and we're saying, wait a second, this is what we're already doing, and let's capture it in this way. And so it's been very, very helpful, and we continue to engage in those conversations.
I'm afraid we're going to have to close out our panel now, and I want to thank the panelists for sharing their insights and lessons from the brave work they did testing and working with DQP and tuning, and hope we can continue to learn from their instructive work. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That session certainly did not disappoint. This picture that seems to be emerging of this sort of pivot, or I don't know exactly what the image is, but the idea of a student-centered system, and that putting the student at the center then makes that student-faculty interaction as being the next key relationship that we need to develop, and then student services professionals, and you work out from that, rippling out. This is such a powerful image, and I want to thank that panel for really helping to develop that idea. As the next panel comes on up, we're not going to take a break, so I'd like to invite everybody to come on up. Amber just handed me a card to let me announce that due to overwhelming popular demand, we paid for the Wi-Fi connection. I don't know whose credit card that went on. It was not mine, but somebody is paying for this. So if you go online, and you, of course, will wait until after this session to do this, and you will only do it for the purpose of tweeting about the session. Weston _Space Conference is the network. The password is Lumina. On my card, it is capitalized. You may want to try it both ways if that does not work. But all lowercase. Well, all right. That it is Lumina lowercase. So, all right. We're now going to go on to talk about accreditation, and a question that I know has been on my mind and I'm sure is on many of our minds, which is the implications of the DQP and tuning and all this work for accreditation. And to help us do that, we have Eric Kelderman from the Chronicle of Higher Education. Welcome, Eric, and thank you for all the panelists.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Some of you might be under the impression that I was asked to moderate this panel because, like my very esteemed peer and friend Doug Letterman, I am one of the perhaps handful of reporters that actually writes about accreditation. But in fact, I was second. Goldie Blumenstick couldn't be here because she's having a book party tonight from the Chronicle for her recent release. So I was the spare. But I'm very happy to be here for a very important conversation. And I want to set this up just a little bit, just briefly. I know time is very short and we've got a lot to talk about. But now that we've heard some feedback from the institutions that are using the DQP, I think it's important that we check in with the organizations that are ostensibly responsible for maintaining and improving the academic quality in higher education, the accreditors. With us today, we have, immediately to my right, we have Karen Solomon, Vice President for Accreditation Relations at the Higher Learning Commission of the North Central Association of Colleges and Schools. We have Karen O'Brien, Director of the Office of Accreditation for the American Library Association, and all the way to my right is Barbara Brittingham, President of the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, Commission on Institutions of Higher Education. Unfortunately, Sandra Ellman, who is in our program, President of the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities, could not be with us today for a very good reason, but if you know her, you can check in with her about that. I want to set this up just a little bit. As I think it's been mentioned, we've sort of reached a turning point in the discussion of higher education policy. In the past, say, 20 years, colleges and universities have shifted. They used to be held accountable only for really the inputs of higher education, and from an accreditor's point of view, that might be, say, the number and qualifications of the faculty, the adequacy of resources to support their mission, and the adequacy of the governance to guide that institution. Now, however, higher ed institutions are also being held responsible for their outputs. The number and rate of degree completions, the readiness of those graduates to succeed in the workforce, and even the earnings of those graduates compared to the amount of debt they have incurred to pay for that degree. I'll remind you all that November 1st is the date for the new gainful employment regs to come out, and I'm sure you're all very excited about that. Lumina, as we know, is already fully engaged in the effort to improve college completions, and the DQP is meant, ostensibly, as a tool for colleges to ensure that those degrees have meaning both for the development of the individual and, to a certain degree, for their vocational aspirations. Given all of that, what does the DQP mean for accreditors, the organizations that we currently think of as the guardians of academic quality? Is the DQP relevant and compatible with accreditation? Will accrediting agencies see the DQP as an enhancement of accreditation or an imposition and a distraction? Do accrediting agencies even have the time and energy to consider how to use the DQP given the scope of challenges and criticisms they face on other issues? So my first question I'd like to ask of Karen Solomon. Don't accreditors already have an extensive set of standards that are meant to ensure the quality and value of the academic experience at your member institutions? How is the DQP different from what you are already doing? And does it fit? Is it compatible with your existing standards?
Our existing standards call for our institutions to understand what they expect students to learn and then also be able to evaluate whether the students are meeting those expectations. But we've gone through some revisions with our accreditation processes, and one aspect that we could actually test the DQP in was a group of pilot institutions that use the DQP as their basis for an improvement project. We have a split and focus on assurance and improvement, and these institutions use the DQP for their improvement project. Many of them were really aligning their courses and doing quite a bit of mapping, but some were also looking at how to integrate curricular and co-curricular activities in a more defined way than they had before. So they went through a multi-year process and evaluated the DQP. I think it was a great point for them to launch and understand where they needed to go. On the other side of it, on the assurance side, the DQP may be helpful for some of our institutions to better articulate their understanding of what students have learned. Where our challenge comes is that our institutions ramp up and identify what they want students to learn, but they often have a very difficult time coming up with any information about what they know about that student learning, and how they've taken that information and then made improvements across the institution, how that information gets moved into the budgeting and planning cycles of the institution. This is an opportunity for our institutions to have defined expectations, those rubrics, being able to take that information and then roll it forward. In some ways, sort of being able to proclaim for a change that they know what's going on with their students and their learning and the successes that they've had, or where there's some opportunities for continual work by the institution to improve that. That's, I think, some of the possibilities that the DQP is bringing to some of our organizations. We had 23 involved in the pilot project, but then we had many others within our region that were involved in individual projects also.
Okay. Ms. Brittingham, I want to know, Karen seemed to allude to this, I think, that the DQP could be something that could be added as one possible framework within the accreditation process. Do you think your member institutions would see this as adding, if you say you implemented this broadly, would it be possible for you to make this, to incorporate this across your region? Or would colleges see this as adding another burden to the already lengthy process that they go through in reaffirmation?
Thank you. That's a great
Would it have to remain voluntary for it to be, to succeed?
Right. New England is a very special region. I'm not from there, but I've lived there for quite a while. And two things I think help explain New England. One is in New Hampshire on the license plates, the state slogan is "Live Free or Die," which offers a rather stark choice, but they seem to like that. And in Rhode Island, as you come into Rhode Island from the north, you see standing on the top of the Capitol Dome a statue of the independent man, and that's who Rhode Island is. So while I think the country as a whole, 75% of undergraduates are in public institutions, in Massachusetts, the majority are in independent institutions, and Rhode Island comes pretty close to that. So the notion of the accreditor saying, this is what y'all are going to do wouldn't work in New England. We did a survey of our accreditation liaison officers, and we found some interesting uses of the DQP, and certainly, we encourage institutions to find things that will help them think about what students know and are able to do. We also found, quite frankly, some institutions that were afraid that this was going to be imposed on them, and it inclines them to run the other way. So our approach is to, make it available, to let institutions know about it, but let institutions decide what's going to be helpful to them. Institutions are asked to talk about what they know in a couple of ways, best summarized in our standard on planning and evaluation, where part of it says the institutions have an understanding of what students have gained as a result of their education based on useful data from recent graduates, and use the information in planning, budget allocation, and for public information. So that's come together, I think, a little more sharply. We're in the process of revising the standards right now, and the Commission generally looks for institutions to address how they know what students know and are able to do, and their success in a couple of ways. And we've separated out assessment and written it, I think, and regarded it as an internal quality improvement mechanism that relies heavily on the involvement of faculty to understand what students know based on what faculty, what the institution wants them to know, and increasingly looking for evidence that they have found information that's useful in improving their programs. And then alongside that, looking at measures of student success, which are quantitative measures, and they're more about public accountability, retention, graduation, and measures that are important to the institution's mission, which in some cases is employability. In some cases, it includes going on for a higher degree. It depends on the institution. For one public institution, it includes how many of the graduates are employed in the state. Can they keep them here? Can they find useful work?
Okay, very good. For Ms. O'Brien, specialized by accreditors by definition have typically a sort of narrower set of concerns in the process. You might disagree with the word narrower, but you can explain that. But they may also have requirements for components of a general education. Could the DQP serve as a framework for those standards, or does it go too far from the point of a specialized accreditor or a programmatic accreditor?
The framework, as I can tell from it, is something that there is some hunger that has built up. I mean, we've been talking about, this outcomes. We've been talking in this language since way before 1990, and the 92 standards were very much about that. Now we're at this place where programs are finding within their institutions a way to work across curriculum. And this is really what the framework, what I see it being a way for not only the profession of librarianship to come together, because it's always been serving across curriculum. That's its major strength. It's usually in most institutions that have an accredited program, they lead in distance ed. So they are speaking across the curriculum as it is. And so culturally, I think this fits quite well. And I think that there's a hunger for it because programs have been building these systems and saying, oh, is this right? Is this okay? Is this, this sort of thing. And I think that I was excited in 2011 to know that this was being built. And so I have been following it, and I was very excited to know that how many people were working with it. And so I think that, as a programmatic accreditor, we do count on the institutions and the regionals to really bring this framework forward, but we also want to be leaders within that framework. So there's that need for it to be underway and active, and then our programs will. I guess what I'm trying to say is they are in a position now to what I see is really welcome this kind of framework.
So what you're saying is you'd be okay if the regional accreditors adopted it, but you're not necessarily going to do it within your agency.
Oh no, well, it's not a matter of. I mean, we are about to bring the new standards to Council of ALA, and there has been 3 long comment collections, and we're at this place where I would say to you, we don't put those kinds of frameworks into our standards. That is not the way we've done it, and sure. Not to say that would right or wrong, but that is not how the standards. But I see no contradiction. Okay. But it is not wholesale. Even the competencies that are at ALA were not brought in wholesale to the standards. They're quite different.
Okay, very good. I'd like to open this up for comments from everybody. The last couple of questions here. We're all aware that accreditation has been under fire, both from state policymakers, federal lawmakers, city attorneys in San Francisco, faculty unions, pretty much everybody, in fact, hates accreditors right now. So there's a growing chorus of critics that are suggesting fundamental changes to the structure and process, including this idea of decoupling Title IV eligibility. Given all that's on your plates in the national conversation and the possibility, maybe not the likelihood, the possibility of the reauthorization discussions beginning after the midterm elections, does the DQP even matter to you? Do you even have the time and the energy to really focus on this as a part of, going forward as a part of your mission and process? Please.
I think, yeah, we certainly have a lot to do, that's for sure. But I think I've been wondering today, and I'd be interested if somebody can help me think about this. One of the things that we're talking about is what I call credits from elsewhere, and this is where students have credits that show up on their transcript that didn't come from an accredited institution. They came from straight or liner, they came from military, they came from MOOCs, they came from ACE credit recommendations, and I can imagine a few institutions that would end up with transcripts that are heavily populated for some students with some credits from elsewhere. It's great to take them, but at some point, I think one of the questions we would have is how does the institution validate that that was a good decision? And one of the questions I have is whether the DQP can help an institution approach that question. Can it help think about validating those decisions for what may well become an increasing number of students at some institutions?
So the DQP could, if broadly accepted by institutions, could help ease the issue about the questions about transfer credits.
No,
but it would have to be.
That's not quite what I was saying.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that there are some institutions, not every institution, but some institutions that have students where the institution serves an adult population with some kind of experience, and the students bring in quote credits from elsewhere. And can the DQP for those institutions help them think about whether accepting those credits worked for those students. Were they able to build on them? Did those students end up fully satisfying the expectations of the DQP as well as, quote, native students who started from the beginning? Is that a useful application? It's a question.
Okay. All right. Any other responses to that question? Karen, do you have any ideas about that? HLC has been an accreditor that has been in the news an awful lot, and I wonder, how you think about going forward. Is there reticence to be on the sort of the cutting edge of any innovation at this point?
Well, I think we'll talk often about that collision between innovation and regulation. And that's the challenge that we're facing as regional accrediting agencies across the country. What's interesting is when, follow up on Barbara's comments, right now the talk across so many of our institutions is about competency learning, competency-based learning. And our institutions want to grant credit for competency. And I'm not moving into the direct assessment conversation. I'm just pure competency in this at this point. But imagine an institution that's adopted the DQP, and students can come and show their ability to meet those expectations across that DQP, whether they've earned those credits at the institution or brought that knowledge to the institution and can test for that. It becomes another point of validation for the institution to say, we're not just awarding credit for what it's worth, but here is a framework that's been built from a national group of experts, been tested across institutions across this country, and we're using that as a framework for our institution. We receive a lot of questions about institutions that are giving away a lot of credit through competency. So DQP may help the accreditors be able to explain these institutions aren't laundering, aren't just awarding random degrees, but they've used a test framework of which to award those competency-based credits.
But again, it would come from the institutional level, not as for instance, it would be, you would say to your institutions, this is great if you use this, but we're not going to require it. That's more or less the message I'm hearing, which is it has to come from the bottom up and not the top down.
Right. Our commission has never adopted one specific model or best practice. We expect our institutions to go out, research, and evaluate what's really best in their best interest.
Recently, the regional accreditors came together and decided on a standardized set of terms for probation, warning, show cause, et cetera. There is some thought that it would be nice if the accreditors had more uniformity across the regions in their processes, in their approaches, that it would be easier to explain to policymakers and the public if there were some uniformity of approach. What would be the problem of using the DQP as that sort of approach, as something that would give you a common voice?
Just before I try to answer that, I think the regional accreditors are going to come together and try to come up with a statement on competency-based education as well to provide some kind of common framework there. Again, I think we have an enormous range of mission of institutions in New England, and the standards are the standards of the membership. We're in a process of revising them, and as I like to say, I get paid for driving around New England in October to meet with the membership. This is a very, very good deal. But the members have to own the standards because it's a system of self-regulation, and the standards represent what they're willing to hold themselves accountable to. And I'm sure we would have institutions that are willing to hold themselves accountable to the DQP as part of that, but we have institutions that aren't also. And so the standards themselves have to be owned by the membership. So there's certainly members that can find ways to use the DQP to help them demonstrate how they meet the standards or to help them think about the expectations that are inherent in the standards. And we have institutions that do that.
Let's open it up to the floor. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that are much better than mine out there. So if you'd like to come up to the mic.
I'm going to do this again. And the writers of the DQP include two of us. We all have worked on accreditation issues. Everybody. Paul, my colleague Paul Gaston, has written a very thoughtful academic advocacy piece about how accreditation has to change, and I hope he asks a question about that. Maybe he won't. Who knows? He's more politic than I am. I did a presentation for NASICI, which, as you know, is the advisory committee to the Department on Accreditation issues. I read 47 accreditation association sets of standards. very carefully on student learning. Let me share with you the results. Of the 47 accrediting associations, all 6 regionals, 4 nationals, and the rest of them specialized, exactly 18 out of 47 actually addressed student learning outcomes required in their institutions, whether it's DQP or something else, to address student learning outcomes in convincing terms. 11 of them made no attempt whatsoever to talk about student learning outcomes, and another 18 used proxy measures. And that's where, when Barbara raised the issue about credits, I said that is one of the most typical proxy measures that's used by accrediting associations, saying it's okay for your school to say the student has earned 60 credits or the student has senior standing, or another proxy measure is the student has completed this piece of the curriculum or that piece of curriculum, and show us how many of them there have. My question after all of this is that looking around, if only 18 out of 47 really required their institutions to present any statements of student learning outcomes as a part of what they are obligated to do, DQP or otherwise, what can you do as a set of accrediting organizations to make sure that everybody does it? And that's, you know, I'm not saying you can use CHIA or you can use some, but you please use something. I'll tell you a couple of good ones to look at. The best of the student learning outcome accrediting statements in that collection were from the specialized accrediting bodies in fine and performing arts. And I don't think there's any question about it to read the music accrediting body, the theater, the dance, and visual arts. Those were the best, you know, all the way down the line. Paul, you might add something to that from your study of it. I hope you will. But my question to them is, what the devil do you do to make sure that everybody uses student learning outcomes and in meaningful ways? Thank you.
We have how long to solve that? First of all, I just want to say that as our commission started to go about standards revision, they had a retreat last June, and they had a panel, and Paul was on the panel. They all got Paul's book to read at a time. We didn't have a quiz, but I know they read it from the comments that they gave us. Paul was on the panel, Judith Eaton from CHIA, and Terry Hartle from the American Council on Education, to sort of bring in this external view of accreditation and sort of pump them up to take on the challenges that face us. I think, you know, I'd be interested if you publish that study, or if you've got it someplace, I'd like to take a look at it. I'm on the CHIA Committee on Recognition, and I know that that's one of the things that the CHIA Committee looks for is evidence of student learning outcomes. But not all accreditors are recognized either by the department or by CHIA, and I know the department looks at that also. So I don't think we're going to solve that one today, maybe.
I'll say this, that we'll give Cliff a dispensation because he was one of the authors of DQP, but if the rest of you could make your questions fairly concise so that we can get through a whole bunch of them.
But I would say, though, actually, that the answer to the question, what do we do? We have programs on conditional, and we have withdrawn accreditation, ultimately, because the outcomes weren't there. That is what we do, as one answer.
Karen, do you have anything?
No.
Okay, all right, let's go over here.
Nan Travers, I'm at SUNY Empire State College, and we've been working on a project that was a Lumina-funded grant to develop a framework for assessing learning acquired outside of the traditional learning environment. So to be brief, in our research, one thing that we did do is we looked at where in the accreditation standards there was statements supporting prior learning assessment and other forms of learning. And what we noticed is only one of the accreditation agencies actually had a statement saying that institutions had to have a statement about what is college level learning. In addition, you know, I think when we step back and, you know, building on what Cliff was talking about, is that what is missing is saying that there needs to be some type of framework that takes those learning outcomes and builds them into degrees, that there's some kind of operational way that an institution is looking at the student and building on all the way through. And I was just wondering if any of the groups are sort of thinking about, not saying you have to use, let's say, the DQP, but that you have to have some kind of structure that you're working under in terms of thinking of how this all fits together.
I'll start this one. Our revised criteria and our assumed practices put some expectations out there that it's not just a set of courses, but there must be a completely thought out, designed, articulated degree. We also have language in our criteria regarding prior learning assessment, that institutions must have policies and practices in place that are transparent for people to understand how prior learning assessment will be evaluated by the institution.
But if I could, I mean, I think what the questioner was asking about was the sort of the cumulative impact of the degree, or the cumulative effect of the degree, which it builds from, you know, point A and goes to point, you know, Z. And is there any sort of comprehensive look at the order and the you know, the accumulated knowledge and experience?
I'll take a pass at that. Our standards do have, I think, a pretty good framework for undergraduate education, and there's a statement in there about graduate education, but I think one of the challenges that we're going to have going forward is looking at graduate education. And when I think about the master's degree, if the bachelor's degree is a new high school diploma, the master's degree is becoming the new bachelor's degree. And the master's degree serves such different purposes, and we're seeing a fascinating array of new master's degrees for people who have bachelor's degrees, for everything from entering a new profession to changing fields to specialized preparation. You know, sometimes we think of the master's degree as discipline-based, and that, to me, is sort of how the DQP looks at it, but there is just this enormous and growing array of the master's degree, so to figure out a framework that really works for that, I think, has become increasingly difficult.
Utah State. I've seen an awful lot of transcripts over the last few years because they all land on my desk when they don't know what to do with them. And the real problem is, I think, that we don't have any common way of talking about what has happened in a course. You know, the first way to articulate something is it the equivalent, is 1,000 level or 2,000 level? Do we have a course like that in our institution? But as soon as you introduce the DQP, and you start asking, well, how does this fit into the pattern of learning? You have problems because you have no data. Because, you know, they invented the college catalog in the 16th century. It's about as useful as it still was, or as it was in the 16th century. So this is a whine, but then there's also maybe a question for you guys, because the regional accreditors, if you think about it, you know, the catchment for a transfer institution, the regional accreditors do have some say about that. And we've seen, like with the Witchy Passport Project, interesting conversations about, can we arrive at a common language about what we need to tell our transfer institutions about students? Could the accreditors do something to make the communication clearer and easier so that articulation and transfer becomes something you can ask about, or what are the outcomes that are in these courses, and where is this student when they reach us?
We do have a statement about, you know, not erecting undue barriers and sort of encouraging transfer. I think the practices vary widely from institution to institution. But again, I go back to this challenge, and really, if anybody can help me think about this, about particularly credits from elsewhere. I mean, when you take a credit from another accredited institution, you have some idea of what you're getting. I don't disagree with what you're saying about the catalog, but there's something there. There's a level, there's an amount of credit, there's a little description there. When you take these credits from elsewhere, you're dealing with different bodies, and I think that is going to increase, and it's more unknown than taking credits from the place down the street. And so how can the DQP be a useful instrument in validating those decisions to bring more students into the system, to go back to Jamie's goal this morning of increasing the number of students who have higher education awards? Is the DQP useful for that population for that purpose? And has anybody tried it?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll follow on that. I think when we talk about the DQP, that's a front-end piece for me. But I keep thinking about the back end, and the whole concept of transcript is something that needs to be reconsidered. The hiring practices in this country have changed dramatically, so that sending in a transcript along with an application, when you've got all of these credits that have been accumulated from different places, employers don't understand what that is, right? So maybe a really sound candidate gets tossed out of the pool because someone in the HR office doesn't understand that the student seems to have bounced around all over the place and picked up credits all. So I think we need to also have this conversation about what is the tool, what is the body of evidence that a student can take with them to demonstrate their learning. And that conversation we haven't had. So I look at it from an accreditor standpoint. The DQP is a nice front-end piece, but the back end is so important. The back end for what have students learned, how do institutions report on that. You know, so many of our institutions write an economic impact report about what they're doing, but how many write a learning impact report? What do our students take? What are our employers looking for? What's going to be helpful for them to be able to differentiate across a variety of students or applicants over time? And that's, I think, another question that we need to layer into this sort of phases down the road for the DQP. How can that better articulate what students have learned and demonstrated over that?
Sharon Valenti, Marymount, California University. The conversation just now, the prior commenter and this recent conversation, we focused on the structure, on the transcripts. I believe it was Barbara talked about compliance versus continuous improvement. To me and to my institution, DQP isn't about the structure. Certainly it provides that. It's about the use of the data, the reevaluation, the continuous improvement. So I'd like to ask the panel, how do each of the accreditors try to address, and actually flows through from Cliff's comments, how do each of the accreditation agencies deal with that continuous improvement aspect, and how do you see DQP fitting in?
One of the things that our commission added, we have a 10-year accreditation cycle. In the middle, we have a report that is cleverly named the 5th-year report. And it's memorable, at least. So it's an update. Sometimes institutions are asked to report on specific things because of our friends at the Department of Ed. They kind of march through the standards. And then the commission added, a couple years ago, the request that institutions submit a reflective essay of 15 to 20 pages on what they knew about one or more of 3 things. 1, retention and graduation, because for some institutions that is really foremost on their mind right now. 2, assessment, that improvement process that involves the faculty. Or 3, what they know about what students have gained as a result of their education, which is a pretty wide open question. And the commission has seen a couple years of worth of those now, and some of them are, many of them I think are worthy of being conference presentations. Some of them are close to publishable. They're really interesting, thoughtful work going on there because institutions have been at assessment and trying to figure out student success long enough now that they can begin to put it together in sensible ways. And some institutions have also used that as a way to, unasked for way to make promises to themselves. Here's what we have now, but by the time of our next comprehensive, here's where we hope to be. And that has seemed to be very useful to institutions.
What's interesting is I think as accreditors, we tend to put out information about what institutions haven't met our standards. So what institutions have gone on sanction or been under heightened monitoring or things like that. We don't, as accreditors, put out good information about what institutions are doing well. So 2 of the 3 accrediting processes in our office have strong components of quality improvement expectations. The open pathway, it's called quality improvement initiatives, and those happen over a 2-year period between the second half of the cycle. And AQUIP, which is our Baldrige-based model, has action projects that our institutions are working on and fulfilling and then closing those down and starting other ones throughout their entire cycle. And our 3rd project melds improvement into the assurance piece. But I think that's one of the flaws, is that our accrediting agencies don't put as much emphasis and effort and resources into bringing out the stories of what our institutions are doing well. And where they're succeeding and how they're doing it and what that reporting mechanism is and things like that. And that's one of the areas in the future we need to
maybe like WASC, all the regional accrediting agencies could just make their team reports and site visit reports public.
Well, the team reports and site visit reports might be helpful, but they're not in language that is understandable for the public and at most. And the improvement process. Right, and reporters, thank you, Rick. And, but also the improvement projects aren't necessarily woven into that team evaluation. They're done by another group of peers. We need to find that stronger balance between assurance and improvements and be able to tell that story more effectively.
Teddy Safman from Utah. Norm sends his most oddball transcripts to me saying, do we have to give credit for this? Barbara, there was something you brought up, and that was employment as a factor of success, how an institution is doing it. And I may be misinterpreting that, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I am. How might accreditation help us, given President Obama's wanting a ranking system that assumes a discipline leads directly to a job when it may lead to many jobs, or our own legislators who would take anthropology saying we shouldn't offer that because they don't get a job directly when they're not talking about skills. So might you address that?
Karen. We have two Karens here. Surely they can address it.
Well, you mentioned discipline, specific. Jobs. Well, that's a very worked on, thoroughly worked subject at ALA, and so the numbers and the job numbers, and we're always in anticipation of that. Programs are held to know their employers and their markets and to be quite close in contact. It's a requirement. They show it. They have to prove it. They show it. At regular meetings, systematic. I keep thinking, what we keep unpacking for programs with faculty is the systematic nature of it, and they're there. They are there. And so where the difference is made in this profession, and I'm assuming in others and ones that I know about in the arts certainly, is where faculty are. So you are there with faculty to help unpack that or hear from them how they unpack what that means. And I've been in this long enough to see the cycle of learning around that, and it really does. It takes some ownership time, but it is being owned. I see this as great promise to help them talk to each other, program to program, in a different way than they have before.
One of the things that we ask institutions to report on in this measures of student success is measures that fit their mission. So for some institutions, it's the percent of students who have a job within 6 months, and that's very important to them. For some, it's the number who go on to graduate school, or includes that, or the number who get admitted to medical school or law school. For some, it's staying on that list that comes out every year of small, medium, and large institutions that send a lot of students to the Peace Corps. So I think that for some, it's the number of startup companies. I mentioned the percent of students who stay in state and are employed. The number, we have an arts institution, and one of their measures is the percent of graduates who are making their living from their art. So this is where mission really comes out, and for some institutions, it varies across the institution. Big, complicated institution, some things would be more important part of the institution than in the other. But mission here is really important, and part of what we try to do is to really kind of push that and say, what is it? How do you know? What are the measures that are important to you given your mission about your graduates, and what do you see when you look at that?
I think we have time for one last question. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Satoko Fukuhori from Japan. I have a question from an international participant. In Japan, we have a declining 18-year-old population, and there's increasing concern about whether we're preparing these people for a global society, and about whether what our degrees means in an international context. And I have been surprised, puzzled all morning how little mention of Bologna, of international, what's happening in the world. And has there been any discussion about what degree programs, what the value of degree programs mean in an international context, and if tuning or DQP will be able to engage faculty in an international dialogue?
That's a great question. I think I'm on a quality group in Ireland and one in Iceland, and they both have very strong government-related frameworks that they use, and it's interesting to watch them. Sometimes you get a little out of hand, even because of people latch onto it. It's government-related, but I think the value here is, as we've heard all morning, the opportunity for faculty to take ownership of something, make it theirs. I think there's language in the publication about fitting it in. I think Cliff may want to say something about the Bologna process here. But I agree with your general comment. There hasn't been a lot of conversation about that this morning.
Would Paul or Cliff care to weigh in on this? Paul?
I think two things. One is that the DQP really does, in a sense, grow out of a reflection on the Bologna process as it might be interpreted for the United States. The other is that in the DQP there is a strong and distinct emphasis on civic and global learning. And in fact, that is one of the ways in which this iteration of the DQP differs from the earlier one, because there is in this a much more explicit, much more operational sense of the importance of global learning.
And what's been interesting, Paul, is that just in our agency over the last 3 months, the number of institutions that have approached our office to say, we're looking to partner with other institutions internationally. What's the framework for that? How do we share, conduct joint degrees, share our learning expectations? Even some of institutions have been requested to take their curriculum and have it adopted by other international institutions and have a growing partnership in that. And I think the DQP has that possibility for that framework in there.
Yeah, I think we need to break. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to break us off, but thank you so much. It's been a very, very interesting session. Eric, thank you. As I said, it's my job to keep us on schedule. We have an hour for lunch. If you've been at Lumina meetings before, you know that you don't get an hour break, that we have work for you to do at lunch. We want you to discuss this question at lunch. How can the DQP and tuning be used to advance these efforts, particularly on campuses, to enhance student learning? And how can NALOA assist? Because after lunch, we're going to come back and talk a lot about the package of support and resources that we hope to make available to help in this implementation. The quick-witted among you will know that that is in fact 2 questions, and that will just kind of shows the how we really try to get the most out of your time and energy here. If you're online, we hope that you will come back. As I mentioned, after lunch, we will be talking much more about the steps going forward. If you're interested in the DQP, in tuning, about what the next steps might be, what resources you might be able to draw on to help move towards use or exploration on your campuses or elsewhere, that's exactly what we'll be talking about after lunch. Lunch will be right next door, and we will reconvene here at 1:30 Eastern Time promptly.